Welcome back to another episode of the Hetio Home Energy Show, and we have our celebrity guest back with us again. Not only the Peronis are back, but we also have Graham Hendra back. Welcome back to the show, Graham.
Well, thanks for having me again. Always a pleasure.
Great to have you back. But we've got some very specific topics to talk about with you today and get your opinion on. I think on the back of the first show that we did and the great response we had from your feedback, we wanted to put some really topical questions to you and see what your thoughts are. And the first one that we're going to discuss today, and it's been in the news quite recently, and it's quite a big change in the industry, is that Octopus Energy have come out and said that they will pay customers the solar export guarantee, which is the only incentive that's now in place for solar, even if the installation has not been completed by an MCS accredited installer. So for those who don't know, MCS, Micro Generation Certification Scheme, that is the standard at which installers have to be accredited in to fit renewable technologies, or so we all believed. But Octopus have now come out and said that they will still pay the solar export guarantee, even if the installation has not been certified under MCS. Which obviously highlights the fact that, for a start, it is not a legal requirement for the installations to be done under MCS, whereas a lot of people compare it sometimes to gas safe. Gas safe is a legal requirement. If you do an installation with anything to do with a gas appliance, it must be notified and completed by a gas safe registered installer and notified to gas safe, or certainly done to the standards for gas safe. But for MCS, that isn't the case then.
No. So just to sort of really clarify where we are, when you buy a PV system, you stick it up on the roof. It looks like a black window. It makes electricity. You squirt that into your wiring of your house, and you can use that to run your washing machine, lights, etc. But if you're making more electricity than you are using, then you are basically a little tiny power station. And you put a little bit of energy back into the grid, and they buy that electricity off you. Some would say for a horribly low price, but we won't discuss that today. But you get a little bit of money for that spare electricity, and that's what this export guarantee is. So and pretty much everybody exports something, especially on sunny days. So everyone wants this guarantee. If you don't want that guarantee, you don't want that money, you can just sling a solar panel on the roof yourself, connect it up. Obviously, probably a good idea to use an electrician. It's a legal requirement to use an electrician, but you can put that up there if you don't want the money back. But everybody does want the money back, so why wouldn't you do it?
But that just to cover on that, and so that where we talk about the legal requirement that is in place, so the legal requirement is that you must, to do any kind of work on a property where you're essentially extending a circuit of any kind in the property, you must use a qualified electrician to do that work if it's in the solar PV world. And a qualified electrician means somebody who has the relevant qualifications to install and design a solar system. They also have to be a member of a competent person scheme, which is that is essentially what gas safe is a competent work. Probably the most well-known one in the electrical world is NIC, EIC, and there's NAPIT. So you must be an electrician who's registered with a competent person scheme. You can go on the roof, you can fit the solar, you can put the battery storage in, you can connect it onto the grid, and legally that installation has to be notified to the competent person scheme, and therefore it must be done up to the most recent regulations that are in place. But crucially, that doesn't mean it has to be done under MCS.
No, so it's got to be electrically safe in a simple way. Much like if you want a new kitchen light or a new electric cooker put in, you could technically put it in yourself, but legally you need to get someone competent to put it in, because you're messing with electricity. It's probably not a very good idea if you don't know what you're doing. And also, of course, if you do it yourself and something goes wrong, it voids your house insurance and so on. So the skill set of the people who are putting this electrical component, just an electrical appliance in your house, is essentially an electrician. Obviously, there's working at heights and all the other stuff. But we've always been led to believe that you have to have MCS accreditation to do this. So just to sort of clarify, if people don't know what MCS is, I'm a bit of a specialist on MCS in heating, right? So not so much in PV, but it's all the same idea. So essentially what the idea was that MCS have laid out a framework of procedures, what you're going to do to make sure the job is done properly. So this is how you design your PV system. This is how you would install your PV system. You're using the correct fittings and so on. There's a formula that tells you how much electricity each panel is going to make if you put it on a west wall or a south roof or whatever. So it's all done, and it's designed to give confidence to the consumer that you're not being lied to. I don't just ring you up and go, I'm going to put one panel on the roof and you're never going to pay an electricity bill again. You can't make those claims. So it was set up with a really, really good idea that, it's to build confidence in these technologies. And I remember when I started in heat pumps all those years ago, I'm not going to say how many years, because obviously Chris got a ribbing from the amount of times he mentioned how long, but he hasn't been in it as long as me. When I started, literally, we would get Mrs. Miggins ring us up. So I've got this house. I'm going to stick a heat pump in, or I'd like to put a heat pump in. And we used to guess how big it was. We had no idea what we were doing. Sorry if you've had a heat pump for a long time, but we were guessing. And MCS came along and said, look, surely we should have a process for how do you work out what size heat pump you want. Exactly the same as a process for how do you work out what size PV system you had. And it made a lot of sense. So it sort of mopped up a lot of the mistakes that were made in the past. We had to give evidence, and it made us all size things correctly and do the design work correctly. But it's always had a bit of a hitch, which is it doesn't say that I'm going to do a good job. It says I've decided that you're going to need 10 panels on the roof or a 10 kilowatt heat pump in your house. But it doesn't say I'm going to install it properly. It doesn't say I build this design, but I don't give the design to the bloke who's installing it. He never even sees the design. He just does what he likes when he puts it in. And so there's always been that disconnect. And one of the things that's been very, very frustrating with both the PV lads, and I'm guessing, I know nothing about Octopus Energy, but I'm guessing what Octopus have done is spotted the same thing that we spotted, which is technologies come along with things like AI and so on, where a lot of the paper filling in, a lot of the data you're filling in is auto lookup. For instance, I'll give you an example in heat pumps. You want a Samsung heat pump. So I call a Samsung heat pump an AE090JXYE. That's not what MCS call it. They call it heat pump, blah, 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 different name. So I have to go online, type in my Samsung number, download the number that MCS call that heat pump and put that in a box. Madness, right? But that's what you do. Now, with computers, they're really good at that. So I type in AE090 and it goes, yeah, you didn't really mean that. I'll just put the other number in. And so very quickly, over a period of time, people started automating the process more and more and more. And MCS have never recognized that. Their solution to that is to give you yet another form to fill in. And every time they brought out a new form, we would just automate the blooming thing out of the way again, mostly in Excel or whatever. And I guess that what's happened is Octopus have gone to them and said, guys, you do know that this is just done by a computer. No human gets involved. It's a pointless piece of paper now. Could we maybe bin off some of this data? And I assume that MCS have said, no, you have to fill this data in every time. And bless Octopus, they're trying to get some volume going. They're doing everything that the government want us to do. Go green, get more panels on the roof, more batteries in, more heat pumps in. And they've seen a gap, which is if we could streamline the process, we don't have to spend a day filling in mindless paperwork, which we have to charge the consumer for. Mm-hmm. We can spend that day installing the blooming thing. And I guess that they've gone to them, had some negotiations, said, can we streamline it? And MCS have kind of gone, no, it's impossible. Everything's got to be done this way. And they've reached a point of frustration and gone, oh, do you know what? To hell with this. Let's see if we can do it without doing any of the paperwork.
Well, maybe any of it, but certainly you can imagine. I Octopus are probably one of the most innovative, agile companies in this industry, and it's in the energy suppliers in this industry. So I can imagine it being hugely frustrating for them to be sat there saying, look, we've seen installations, we've modeled these scenarios. If we do an installation all virtually in comparison to going to site and doing these 10 bits of the process, it makes no difference. And I'm sure they would have turned up, if this is the journey that went on, they would have turned up with evidence to show, look, we're a good company. We're going to deal with complaints properly. We don't need an MCS quality management system to tell us how to look after our customers. We're going to do it a good job anyway. So if that is the minimum standard a company has to meet, fantastic. I'm sure Octopus have met that and gone way over and above that. And then they've gone into the process of doing the designs, and they've seen that they can with the intelligence they've got, I'm sure they've got access to be able to design systems without having to go to somebody's house. So that if they're in a situation where they will say to a customer, look, we will do you a fixed price quotation. We've used Google Earth. We've used the relevant, any data they've got available to them on how that home's performing, smart meter data and everything else that you can use to accurately design that system and how it's going to perform based on what that customer's using. And if they've gone and gone, look, we're more advanced, we're here. And they've been told, no, you still have to send a surveyor out. You still got to do this, this, and this. And they've looked at it and gone, as we've looked at it recently and seen the cost per job with all the notifications and everything else that goes on and the consumer code registrations and everything else, you look at about £500 with if you include the time it takes to do all those process stuff. Manually do all those process things. So if they've said we can knock £500 off every solar installation by not doing this, but we can still achieve a great result for our customers, and MCS has potentially said no, and we are speculating here as to how that conversation went. But ultimately, if they've gone, well, we're gonna do it without it. Whether they engage with MCS at all, potentially, they just might have said, look, we can do this and we can do it without it, and it'll be as it stands. It's only them who are offering this. Isn't it, that they're saying from a solar export guarantee, da. But where we've seen it in heating and heat pumps, and even in solar in days gone by, the additional benefit was that, for instance, in solar, you got the feed-in tariff.
Yeah.
And you only got the feed-in tariff if you were MCS, if you used an MCS accredited installer who followed the MCS processes and used MCS accredited product. And now we have the grant, the £5,000 grant in place for heat pump systems. Again, you can only get access to that if you use MCS accredited installer, MCS accredited product. But I don't think there's any danger that just because Octopus have come out and said you can still have a solar export guarantee if you don't use an MCS accredited installer, that Octopus aren't going to have their own checks and balances to ensure that that installation has been done to a good standard. I would imagine they've literally put that in place to allow for their own workforce to do those installations.
Well, they're in a slightly unique position, aren't they? Because they're selling you the electricity and buying the electricity off you and selling you the installation. So I'm assuming that they are, again, I haven't looked into it because it doesn't bother me too much. I'm incredibly dull and into heat pumps. But they've got everything, all the information is there because they can see what's coming in. They're buying the electricity off you and so on. And I'm assuming that if you get up a ladder tomorrow afternoon and sling a couple of panels on the roof of your house, they're not going to sign you off because they don't know you from Adam. So I assume that what they're going to do is work on most of their own work.
Exactly.
Which is happy days. And I think, if I was at MCS, I would be thinking, blimey, these people have found a way around us. We need to become more relevant again. And I've never spoken to anyone at MCS in my life. I spent my entire last 12 years automating everything they fired at us and just making it go away. And I would think that they should be thinking we need to still stay relevant, because if they've done this with solar, guess where they're looking next?
Well, I was gonna say, this is a great reason to have you on the show, because as you say, you spent your life in heat pumps, and I don't think anybody has spent as much time looking at heat pump systems. And for people who follow the show and don't know about heat pump systems, I'm assuming you don't follow the show because we pretty much talk about them on every episode. But essentially, a heat pump is an alternative to a boiler. It produces heat and hot water for the home. We make them very complicated, and the average consumer probably doesn't come across them on a day-to-day basis or even think about them. But when we look at the transition that the UK has made, and we had Glenn Brewer on from AES on the previous show, and we talked about AES's a big installation firm, their transition from being an electrical installation firm to how they've grown strategically in line with the renewable industry. They started doing smart meters, 21 million smart meters installed in the UK now. Then they grew into doing EV chargers, God knows the numbers around that. Then they expanded into solar PV. And then they started looking at heat pump systems and moving into that side. That transition that they've made as a company lines up very, very closely to what we see when we receive a consumer inquiry. So we'll get an inquiry come in. Typically, the customer has had a smart meter installed. They went, oh, I can see how much energy I'm using. And then they go, oh, I think I'm going to have some solar installed because it's the next logical thing. It's been proven. People know where it's at. Probably the reason why Octopus are doing what we've talked about. They've seen an opportunity to go and put this en masse, and actually a 500 quid cost on every job is pretty brutal that they could take out, open it up to more customers, be able to streamline the installation process more. But then that customer who's looking at solar and battery, the next thing they start looking at is what they can do around heat and hot water. So you can see with companies like AES, they're getting their strategy in place for heat and heat pumps. Octopus, absolutely getting their strategy in place for heat and heat pumps. They're actively out there doing it. A lot of the energy suppliers are. It's still an emerging industry because there's incredible amounts of boilers going in still. But everyone's just starting to set that foundation. So what does it mean from an MCS perspective if somebody like Octopus can look at solar and circumvent it? What happens with MCS on heat pumps?
If you go on LinkedIn, it appears that if MCS went away tomorrow, everybody would become a cowboy, sling the units in badly, rip off old ladies, and it would be a disaster. That's what you hear. And I don't believe that at all. I think that's complete rubbish. If you are an installer, MCS or not MCS, and you're a bit of a cowboy, it doesn't matter. You're a cowboy. If you are good at your job, and there are some spectacularly good installers out there, they're not going to do a dreadful job just because they didn't have to fill 68 pages of paperwork in. That's how big MCS is at the moment. I know
68 pages on every installation.
Awful. Of the same mindless information again and again and again. Your address, just don't get me started. They're not going to suddenly go, right, that's it, we're slinging them in now. That isn't the case. We used MCS because it was put in with the best intentions to make sure that the people weren't being ripped off. The right size units were put in, and it worked really, really well. As I said, it just needs to evolve with the industry. I'll give you some really crazy examples, right? So back in the bad old days, we didn't know how much output the heat pumps gave, and we didn't really know how much heat you needed because we didn't do a heat loss. So we go big house, big heat pump, sling it in, hope like hell. And back then they used to use electric heaters inside the heat pumps. You go, if it's a bit light, we'll just bring the electric heaters on and everything will be all right. And you'd end up with really horrible run costs, especially if the heaters were used enormously. And lots of people, that's where a lot of those sort of horror stories you hear from people going, oh, yeah, they cost me a fortune. They tend to be really old installs. And MCS said, no, let's size them. So if you work out that you need 7 or 8 kilowatts and so on, and we're going to make sure the unit is a little bit bigger. So MCS encouraged a little bit of oversizing. There's no upper limit. So if you need 10 kilowatts, there is nothing to stop me putting 50 kilowatts in. Madness, apart from price. But it made sure you weren't going to be cold. The next thing that they did was they made us do a calculation on your house on every single room to work out that the radiators were the right size. And again, brilliant idea at the time. Because when this was written, I was selling what was then called Generation 3 Samsung. One of my favorite units. I have the oldest one in the world at home. That machine, if you kicked it to death, would give you 48 degrees C water. So you were going into a house that had a gas boiler where the radiators would be 70 degrees, sort of scalding hot. You just about touch them for a few seconds. And I was going to put a machine on that if I beat it to death would only do 50, which you can literally hold on to for half an hour. So they said, look, we've got to get these radiator sizes right because we're dropping the temperature so far. And it made sense. So we all did the calcs and worked it all out. But the world's not like that anymore. No. My heat pump at home does 80 degrees C. It's hotter than the boiler that was originally in there. So you don't have to size the radiators anymore. You can, if you want to, you do whatever you like. But the sizing of the radiator is not so important anymore, which means that you don't need to do so detailed a calculation anymore. Also, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I wrote a heat load calculator because there wasn't one. I think you wrote one at the same time. Yours was not as good as mine, but Mine won a couple of awards, actually.
Yours was in Excel, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Mine was the software version.
Yeah,
but yeah, no, you're right.
Mine won the Graham Hendra Award for Best Heat Load Calculator 2012.
I'm not going to knock the Graham Hendra Awards because I won one last year. So.
I won that award, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I wrote this calculator. I could be the biggest, scumbag known to man, and I could have no idea what I'm doing. Nobody has ever looked at that calculator to see whether I did the maths right.
And how many calculations has it done?
35,000.
So there's going to be a vast proportion of the heat pumps in the UK that went in under your calculations.
We weren't very good at converting the orders, to be honest. We got about 1 in 3, 1 in 3.5. So we did these tens of thousands of heat loss. Not all me, my team did it back when I was in distribution. And we churned these calculations out. Nobody checked. So, for instance, you could send me a drawing of your house and tell me your house was built in 2020. And actually what you meant by that was 1920. But I don't know that. Mm-hmm. So I'm putting 2020 data in. To give you an idea, just to give you a really rough idea of what that means, I live in a 1920s house. My house, the heat loss is 4 times as high as a brand new build. Just in that 100-year difference. My house is exactly 100 years old. So getting the age of the house wrong is really, really fundamental. But nobody checks. So I just pummel the information in, and I do a very, very detailed calculation on some really appalling data and produce this lovely design, and I select a Samsung heat pump of 12 kilowatts, and I give you a radiator schedule and so on. And that's it. And you go, there we go. That's what you should go and buy, and the installer will put in. But I don't actually tell him how to put it in, how to wire it up, how to set it up. I just say he or she will turn up with some boxes, and in those boxes will be heat pump A and radiator X, Y, and Z.
And to be clear, the MCS standards also don't tell that installer how to fit X, Y, and Z.
No, the assumption is that the manufacturer will do that.
Or the training. They should have gone on a course which would have taught them, and the course, for the most part, as you know, even the certified courses, is a 4 or 5 day course where you're going to spend 3 days being told how to fill out the bullshit calculations that you've just talked about there, and then you might have half an hour around standing around the equipment looking at faults, and then you've got an exam on the final day. So nobody's getting taught to plumb it in, because the assumption is that by the time you get to that course, you've already got the baseline qualifications to be able to do plumbing and heating. So we can kind of safely say that the MCS standards aren't there to teach people how to install a heat pump.
No.
It's to design a heat pump system.
Yes, it's to make sure the boxes that are delivered are going to be big enough for the job. And it has been enormously successful at that. And that's how it should be promoted, is that we will make sure the boxes are big enough. There should be some kind of mechanism, I think. If I was running MCS, well, blimey, it would be very different. It'd be one sheet of paper and it would be online. What you would do is you would have some kind of design that said you will set it to these temperatures and so on. Very, very simple to calculate. My calculator had that free of charge. It was in there. I don't know if yours had that, but mine did. So it actually told the installer what size pipework they were supposed to use and so on, and the flow rates and all the bits that the engineer really wants to do. And I would make sure they got that data, and then it would be really handy when during your inspection that the inspector turns up and says, it says here you're going to make this setting, that setting, that, and I want to check that. Because one of the things that is not really discussed very much is, let's say I've designed you an ultra efficient machine that's designed to run at, let's say, 45 degrees C. It's very trendy. Some people like that. I'm the commissioning engineer. I don't like 45 degrees. I'm going to set it to 60 and leave. Nobody checks. There's no... So you then say, but why is first off, my radiator is really hot. And second, my run cost is a lot higher than it was predicted. And you go, yeah, because nobody actually tied those two bits up.
But it just to chunk it up a little bit. So we've got the design process and all this stuff that, as an installer, you need to consider. And I would probably, if I interviewed 100 customers, 99 of them would say, I don't really care about that. For the majority of people, not your heat pump enthusiasts, probably the people that are having heat pumps fitted now, I'm sure they would be, they'd probably quite like to sit down and do their own calculations and how all that stuff works. But for the majority of the customers, people who just say, my boiler's broken, I'm now looking at a replacement boiler, they're going to say, you come in and fit it. And this is the backstory, isn't it? This is all the stuff that we've got to do as an industry to should do when we're designing a heat pump system to make the thing work. And MCS essentially tells us that's what we've got to do. But if somebody like an Octopus Energy said, well, we're going to do all that stuff anyway. We're not going to do it doesn't matter whether MCS tells us to do that or not. We're going to do all this stuff anyway, because that is the right way to do it. And I'm sure there is boiler engineers up and down the country that, even though you don't necessarily need to, would have the capabilities to do those things to size a heat pump or a boiler for a property. So if Octopus have looked at solar and said, well, we do all this stuff anyway, and then we don't do this stuff because it's not really adding to the customer's journey, it's adding cost. Logically, you would suggest that if they're building an installation team, they're going to be looking at the heat pump process and saying the same thing again. But there is a downside to that. Isn't you can't get the £5,000 grant. But if I was Octopus and you had the buying power of Octopus, and you had the ability to drive down that cost of the installation in the customer's house anyway, then maybe you start taking a chunk out of that £5,000. But is there anything that you're aware of that is in the MCS process for heat pump systems that absolutely, from a legislative perspective, would say that you cannot put this in?
There is one. I mean, when I read this, it sort of reminds me of sort of Central African dictatorships, and because it's astonishing. So there's a really weird quirk in MCS. So if you want a heat pump installed in your house, you need planning permission. Okay? I don't know why, but you do. Nothing to do with MCS, but in the planning regs, you need planning permission.
If I wanted to put it anywhere?
Yeah, you've got to have. It's the most bizarre thing. Whoever wrote this, this is the first thing that needs sorting out.
So I can put a shed outside?
Yeah, you can put a shed which is 20 times the size of a heat pump, but because it says heat pump on it, you have to have planning permission. Right, so there we go. I don't know what happens if you put a heat pump in a shed.
And then take the shed down later.
Let me think on that one. Don't put heat pumps in sheds. You can read that in my book. So it's the orange one, by the way. So you need planning permission for this fairly small box that's going to go outside. Okay, so what MCS have done, which is brilliant, is they said, if you do it under the MCS scheme, you fill in all the paperwork and do blah, 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 not only do you get your £5,000 grant, which everybody would want, but you can do it under what's called permitted development, which is kind of assumed planning permission. There's a few rules, but essentially you don't need planning. So it's one of the really major things. You go, happy days. I've got MCS, I've got £5,000, and I don't need planning permission. And I'm no expert on the law or anything else, but if you wanted to put a heat pump in yourself, in your house, and you don't want the £5,000 for some reason, you don't need the money. Say, for instance, you could get heat pumps for nothing because you're a wholesaler, someone like me, and you stick one in your house, you have to then apply to planning permission, which takes 3 weeks, if you're lucky. So somehow that is the bit. That is the only reason you really need MCS, is if you want the money and you don't want to go to planning for this little box, which is much, much smaller than your car or your garage or whatever.
But so if you apply for, let's say you say, well, I'm not gonna follow the MCS process, because the MCS process, there's a standard in MCS called MCS 020, I think it is, which specifically is about size, putting the heat pump in such a position where it could be noisy to neighbours or anything like that. So if you start at that point, in order to get permitted development, so where you don't have to apply to planning, assuming planning is this hugely bureaucratic process and all that kind of stuff. So we say we're going to go down the non-planning, the permitted development route. Sorry, we're going to go down the permitted development route. Permitted development route says we have to comply with MCS 020, so we have to design the system compliant with the noise calculations around that. And that standard says it has to be designed in compliance with MIS 3005, which is the heat pump design standard. Therefore, we're back out again doing everything that's involved in that process, including being an MCS accredited contractor on the quality management system side.
Yes.
So if I just went to planning and made an application, you say 3 weeks.
Well, if you're lucky, yeah.
But
it's not 68 pages of paperwork, though.
No, and I tell you what, I've had DNO applications take 3 weeks.
Yeah, but it's 3 weeks. So assume you're an installer, right? And you're on the path today and you go, should I be MCS? Should I not be MCS? You make those decisions. So I've decided I'm not going to be MCS. I'm just going to stick them in and go down the planning route. You ring me up, your boiler's gone bang. Would I put a unit in your house and then apply for planning? What happens if they say no?
Mm-hmm.
So I got to say to you, no, sorry, you can't have any hot water until the planning people come back. To me, it's the maddest thing of all. If I was in power, I would say renewables are all permitted development. Solar panels, heat pumps, just get them in.
You'll end up then. You see when you go to go to Spain and you see all these ones hanging off buildings and.
Yeah, but they're never beautiful buildings, are they? No one's going to screw it on the side of Winchester Cathedral, put a ruddy great box on the side. It's and a load of solar panels on your local church. That's not going to happen. But so that is the one thing, and that really irritates me, that there's that tiny, tiny little hurdle of you will. To me, it smacks of. Not joined up legislation. The government allegedly, it's difficult to tell where they stand on green issues. They change their mind so much. But the message generally is that we should go green and do some green stuff. And then another department's going, no, we're going to stop you going green. Mm-hmm. And I think I think there's a lot of MCS bashing. We have to accept they've done a really, really good job of what they did. It needs a complete rocket up the backside and completely redoing. I mean, one of the things you hit on then, MIS 020. MIS 020, I'll explain what it means very briefly. Essentially, the idea is that I have to prove that if I went to your neighbour's house, to the nearest openable window of your neighbour's house, the noise at that window is not going to disturb the neighbour. And there's a level which I can't remember because I automated it 13 years ago and never looked at it since. And so instead of putting the unit in and getting a noise meter and measuring it, they give you this lovely formula and you put some information in about, things like, can you see the window from the heat pump? How far is the heat pump away? That kind of stuff. That was really relevant 12 years ago. Units used to be noisy. As we showed in the famous Samsung HTQ coffee cup storming off episode, you can't tell if the bloody thing's on. Yeah. So I don't think people even do the calculation anymore. There's no point. Essentially, as long as the unit isn't touching the neighbour's window, it's quiet enough. So, and again, MCS should have looked at that and gone, we don't need this anymore. The units are so quiet, it's irrelevant. Delete. But you still fill that.
And is that going to be a potential catalyst for somebody making this move? Because I think where the market has the greatest opportunity is probably into combi boiler market, where you could potentially fit a heat pump alongside an existing boiler. You're not eligible for the grant anyway, so that's out the equation. Yet you still have to follow the whole MCS process. So if somebody goes down the route, as you said, the mandatory requirement is to use permitted development rights. Everything else comes with it. If you want to get the grant, you have to do all the MCS process. Yeah. If you want to use permitted development rights, you have to use all the MCS process. So somebody says, well, tell you what, I'm not bothered about the grant, and I'm not bothered about permitted development rights. I'll quite happily make an application to my local planning officer and see that come through. Then that is potentially the opportunity to completely circumvent the MCS process. Yep. But you still have to be a member of a competent person scheme. Yeah. You've still got to notify the installation to building control legally. Yep. So that there is still those requirements in place. Yeah, you still have to install the cylinder under G3, like every cylinder that every plumber installs. The Sparky has still got to be a qualified Sparky. The plumber has still got to be a plumber. So you still get a good job. I mean, there are awful jobs, but as a rule, people do the job well. So that's the bizarre thing. So Chris was talking, he has a hybrid system, and all the reasons why he has a hybrid. Bizarrely, he didn't get the grant because he didn't rip his boiler out. He didn't need it. He got the unit for nothing. He stuck it in, but he still had to go through all that paperwork just because he wanted to put the unit outside in his back garden, which no one could see, to prove that he didn't need planning permission. He had to go through the whole MCS process. So the argument would come back, permitted development rights. He's used permitted development rights. So if anybody ever came and complained about that installation, he could say, this falls under permitted development rights because I used an MCS accredited contractor and an MCS installer. Yeah. What about the DNO? In order to fit a heat pump onto the electrical network, you have to either before or after the installation, depending on the product, notify the person, the organization who looks after your network, the district network operator. You have to tell them you're doing this. My understanding from going through that process a couple of times now is that you have to tell them you're an MCS accredited contractor and share with them your MCS number. Yeah. You have to tell them that you have what the MCS number is of the product you fitted. But at no point that I've seen, and I'll need to double check it, that you are declaring that this installation has been done to MCS standards.
Again, I'm not an expert on the DNO. It's another subject that makes my blood boil, but we'll talk about that another day. But the crazy thing is that if you are an electrician, you're working on the electrics, you sign off, your new cooker, your new lights and so on. You have to be qualified. And also it's your duty to check that the power supply coming into the house is correct size. I mean, all the DNO really means is the cable coming out the ground that you don't own, you own everything after the meter, is that big enough? If you put huge amounts of power on a little cable, obviously you've got fire risk and so on. So they're checking that it's big enough. But that's kind of already done by the electricians. So what we're doing is we're saying to the electricians, you're really, really good at this and you do lighting and cookers and so on and everything else. But we don't believe that you're good enough, even though you've been doing it for 30 years. So you've got to fill in another form, because what happens is that form confirms that you're good at your job.
And you're definitely not going to pull that out.
And that is, unfortunately, in the background behind all of these schemes is a bunch of people who genuinely believe that if you fill in more bits of paper, you get a better job.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Nobody's saying that. Yeah, if you release and open up legislation, that naturally, as you do that, you're gonna open up more installations, so the percentage of the number of bad installations might go up, but probably not any greater than the percentage of bad installations that's there now. But as you say, having reams of paper aren't necessarily just making installations better. Because I think at the same time, we're probably keeping some very, very good engineers out of the industry because of those 60-odd pages that they've got to complete on every job.
Yeah, but we've always had an obsession with that here, that, what we want to make your local sparky and heating engineer into an accountant. We think it does them good to spend the weekend filling in paperwork.
Yeah.
I have never met an installer who says, I can't wait to get home and fill in these forms. And what's happened, I think, which has weakened the position of all of these things, is AI and computer programs. I've spoken to many a person who's going, we are getting rid of this process. You guys are working on not filling in 68 pages, trying to get it down to 1 or 2 pages. So, with the rise of computers and learning machines and so on, it's blooming obvious that if you are in a job where she's just filling in data, that can't last. It won't last. And, hopefully MCS see that, and I know that Chris was very excited about this blooming thing where they're going around asking people for their advice. Hopefully they get some really good feedback. It's a very, very strange process. I don't know if you've got involved. I haven't got involved at all because I'm a mercenary bastard and I don't do anything for nothing and they don't want to pay for my time. So you get someone else to give the time for nothing.
I've been too busy filling out the 68 pages of paperwork to go and fill it in.
Yeah, and
there will be definitely people in the industry who go, if you haven't got time to comment on that legislation, I've read it, but at the same time, I will quite happily put a post up on LinkedIn saying, I think this needs to change. But I literally spend, I think it was last Friday evening, I spent 3 hours completing paperwork for a single installation that had been done and finished that week.
That's because you're using your calculator. So if you'd used mine, it would have automated.
No, I'll tell you what I had to do. I had to notify the installation to HICE as our consumer code to get the job registration number. I had to notify the installation to NAPIT to get the CPS for the heating and hot water install. I had to notify the installation to the microgeneration scheme and go through the 10 steps on there. I then had to notify it to the boiler upgrade scheme to get the redemption of the voucher. So to do that, okay, and each one of them asked their own specific questions and the information that they need, and same information being fed into each one. And that's I'm talking that's at the end of the installation.
And that's what drives me mad is you go that people will, right, you can see it. There's some really clever sort of heat losses and so on, whether it's looking up stuff online automatically. That is what's going to happen. And I don't understand why people don't see that and go, well, we may as well get rid of a lot of it already or have a central place where you do all this.
Exactly.
But that's the thing that has always really surprised me about MCS. I mentioned I wrote a calculator and you wrote a calculator. If I was MCS, I would have said, if you want to go through the scheme, then you've got to use an MCS certified calculator. And there's an MCS certified website where you will put all the data. They could, that's how I would make money if I was at MCS. You have to use our calculator. You have to pay a $5 every time you use our calculator, because then we can check the maths. It's all done online, so it's all held in a central database and secure and so on. You fill in one form and MCS then send that to ICE and all the other people.
Logic, that would be the case.
Yeah, as the sort of central place. And then it could be much, much more efficient. And I've never understood why they don't do that.
But this is, I think we're genuinely getting to the problem with it. And I genuinely believe somebody, if it's not Octopus, somebody will do this. They're going to say, look, absolutely right at the start of this industry, in the heating world, and in solar, I'm sure, and the same with us, we needed this in place. And to be perfectly honest with you, with the renewable heat incentive and the feed-in tariff, we couldn't not do it. Now there's an opportunity to not do it, certainly in solar, and it may well become the case in the boiler swap for heat pumps, especially where you're not planning on getting the grant anyway. Because if you're doing putting a heat pump and you're going to keep a combi boiler to do the hot water, there is no grant anyway. So there's a huge opportunity there. What is it? 80% of homes in the UK have got gas boilers. 80% of those gas boilers are combi boilers. So if somebody wants to hit that market, then the only thing they need to figure out is how to simplify the planning. And then all that paperwork that I spent 3 hours of my Friday doing for a single installation, and Octopus and others will be doing hundreds of these installations. That's a lot of time and money.
And they will sort that. That is, if you can't see that, then you're mad. I mean, the system at the moment is designed around a tiny, tiny industry where we were doing our, 5,000-10,000 installations a year, and all the new builds didn't need MCS anyhow. But they haven't scaled with us. So it's kind of like the kit has got better and hotter and easier. The installers have got better. We, the distributors and all of us techie geeks, made the units simpler and simpler and simpler. Some made them more complicated, but we tried to make them simpler. And I feel that somebody at MCS, when we did an amazing job 10 years ago, nothing needs touching, and we're going to leave it. And that way lies disaster, which is a shame because it was started with good intentions and it did work quite well. But they're not going to listen to me, and especially not for nothing.
Well, this is it. With it, they say MCS heed the warning, because for those who are interested in this space and watching this space, is keep an eye out, because it could change, and it could change dramatically, and it could have a huge impact on the cost of heat pump installations and the numbers of heat pumps being deployed. If anybody's going to do it, it's going to be one of the big boys. So watch this space. Watch Octopus. We'll monitor the situation from our side, and no doubt have Graham back on when or if this does happen to say, I told you so.
After the apocalypse.
Yes. Thank you very much, Graham.
No worries. Pleasure.
Join us again next time. Thanks for watching the show.